Why would tens of thousands of Jewish travelers from New York, Tel Aviv, and London be willing to enter a country at war? Boarding flights towards sirens rather than away from them, crossing borders that their own embassies advise against. And why, despite every danger, do they return again each year, gathering in the same towns at the same time, as if some pull existed that no warning could reach and no headline could diminish? Beneath the sound of air raid alerts and the steady scroll of travel advisories lies one of the strangest and most beautiful landscapes in Europe. A place where the Chernobyl runs so deep and so dark that the ground itself seems to belong to an older category of Earth altogether. Almost black, even in bright sunlight, and where sunflower fields open out so wide that they appear to bend the horizon around them, as if the land had simply outgrown the frame meant to hold it, stretching past the edge of what a single glance can take in. This is also a place where the cobblestone streets of Lviv still carry the layered architectural memory of 6 different empires, each one arriving with its own language, its own currency, its own idea of permanence, ruling for a time and eventually leaving. Their facades left behind like sediment, one era settling quietly over the last, never quite reaching the city's deeper identity beneath them. And in Kyiv, golden domes still catch the first light of morning exactly as they have for over 1,000 years. Above a river that has never once changed course because of a decision made in some palace or parliament, indifferent to every flag that has flown along its banks. Sirens rise over the rooftops. Warnings are issued, repeated, renewed, year after year, almost as routine as the seasons themselves. And still, they come because some destinations exist outside the logic of safety entirely, answering to a need far older and far deeper than caution. A pull that has outlasted empires and shows no sign of loosening now. This is Unreal Ukraine. At the heart of Ukraine's geography lies Chernobyl. The black soil covering a vast stretch of the country and accounting for nearly a quarter of the world's total reserves. Not a mountain, not a coastline, but a layer of ground so fertile that it has shaped the nation's fate more decisively than any natural border ever could. The land here is flat for hundreds of miles, with sunflower fields and wheat stretching to a horizon that seems too wide to belong to one country, and with nothing, no ridge, no river wide enough, no forest deep enough to slow movement across it. The eye finding no obstacle to rest on for as long as the journey continues. And yet, scattered across this plain, the land occasionally contradicts itself, as though the openness were not the whole story, but only the surface of it. In one place, granite older than most of Europe breaks through the soil in a narrow canyon, walls of ancient rock rising where nothing but wheat should grow. Elsewhere, a city builds itself onto a peninsula almost entirely encircled by a gorge. Its houses and fortress balanced above a river that has spent centuries cutting the ground away beneath them. Further north, a wilderness of unplowed steppe stretches to every horizon, deliberately kept exactly as it has always been. While in the capital, a single transit line sinks deeper underground than almost anywhere else on the planet, descending beneath a skyline of golden domes that have stood for 1,000 years above it. Ukraine's geography, then, is not one extreme, but several, layered on top of one another in ways that rarely announce themselves until you are standing inside them. Openness, depth, antiquity, and isolation, each appearing exactly where it seems least likely, as if the land itself were arranged to contradict whatever it had just shown you. Stretching across central and eastern Ukraine for hundreds of miles, the Chernobyl belt is quite literally the ground itself. A layer of black soil so rich that it holds nearly a quarter of the world's reserves, flat to the horizon, largely treeless. With wheat and sunflower fields turning gold and green in slow alternation under skies that seem too wide to belong to one country. This landscape looks unreal, not because it is dramatic, but because it offers nothing to hide behind. No ridge, no river wide enough, no forest deep enough to slow movement across it, only soil so dark it can look almost wet, even in dry weather. For the people who live here, this openness is not extraordinary. It's everyday life. Villages built low and close together against winds that travel for miles. Daily rhythms shaped by short growing seasons and the constant need to move quickly when the weather allows. Harvests timed almost to the hour. This place did not become unreal by accident. For over 1,000 years, the same fertility that fed empires also made the land a corridor for armies moving east and west, with no natural barrier ever able to stop them. What happens when a place becomes famous for being unreal is a question the steppe has answered repeatedly. It remains both the source of abundance and the site of its cost. Beneath the sunlit streets of Odessa lies another city entirely, a limestone labyrinth stretching roughly 1,500 miles. Its narrow passages branching endlessly into total darkness with no single plan, and, by some estimates, over 1,000 entrances scattered across the region, many no wider than a doorway, hidden behind courtyard walls or beneath ordinary basements. This landscape looks unreal, not because it is beautiful, but because it is nearly impossible to map. A void beneath a city, growing for 2 centuries as the very stone that built Odessa's grand boulevards and opera houses above was quarried from below, leaving behind a hollow mirror image of everything standing in the sunlight, room for room, street for street. For the people who once depended on it, this was never a curiosity. During the Second World War, several thousand partisans lived inside these tunnels for over a year, cutting sleeping shelves into the cold stone walls, building limestone stoves whose smoke vanished into empty chambers above, and running a makeshift hospital by candlelight for them. This darkness was simply everyday life, measured not in days, but in how long the food and air would last. This place did not become unreal by accident. A city quarried its own foundation, first for economic reasons, then turned to that same hollow ground for survival when the surface became unsafe, repeating the cycle each time history demanded it. Today, sections continue to collapse unpredictably, and new construction above has been restricted because of it. The city quietly adjusting itself around a ground it can no longer fully trust. Near the small town of Cleven, a narrow railway disappears into what looks, from a distance, like a perfect green tunnel, trees arching overhead for nearly 3 miles. So symmetrical, it seems designed rather than grown, the light filtering through in soft, shifting patches that change with every season and every hour of the day. This landscape looks unreal, not because it is untouched, but because its order conceals its origin. Built during the Soviet era to move timber and disguise rail access to a nearby military site, the line was deliberately hidden by dense planting decades ago, the trees positioned and left to grow exactly as concealment required, with no further instructions ever given. For the people living nearby, this is not a fantasy corridor, but working infrastructure. A freight train still passes several times a day to a functioning plywood factory, brushing against branches that close in again behind it within hours. The sound of the engine arriving long before the train itself appears between the leaves. This place did not become unreal by accident. A structure built for concealment and utility was slowly absorbed by the landscape around it, until secrecy itself became scenery, and the original purpose of the line became almost incidental to what it had visibly turned into. What happens when a place becomes famous for being unreal is visible here in real time, as a quiet, industrial line becomes one of the most photographed romantic sites in Eastern Europe, its beauty a byproduct of purposes no visitor ever sees, asks about, or even suspects while walking beneath the arch of green. High in the Carpathian Mountains, at roughly 3,250 feet above sea level, Lake Sinova sits in near total stillness, its water so cold and so clear that even in midsummer, only the top few feet ever truly warm. while the rest remains locked in a kind of permanent winter that visitors can feel the moment they wade in past their knees. This landscape looks unreal, not because it is vast, but because it is so contained, a small, near-perfectly oval body of water with a central island, giving it an eerie, eye-like appearance from above, locked between centuries-old spruce forests, far from any major road. The surface rarely disturbed by more than wind or the occasional bird crossing it. For the communities of the surrounding Carpathian region, the lake is not a strange phenomenon. It's everyday life, a familiar landmark woven into oral storytelling with tragic local legends offering human explanations for a landscape shaped by forces no one could otherwise account for, passed down at gatherings long before anyone thought to write them down. This place did not become unreal by accident. It was formed in a single moment around 10,000 years ago, when an earthquake or landslide sealed a mountain valley shut, and the silence that followed has lasted almost unchanged ever since, broken only by the 3 small streams that still feed it. What happens when a place becomes famous for being unreal is, here, almost the opposite of elsewhere. Increasing numbers of visitors now arrive, seeking exactly the stillness that violence created, drawn to a quiet that elsewhere would be considered ordinary. In the rolling farmland of central Ukraine, where the land is otherwise flat for hundreds of miles, a narrow granite canyon suddenly cuts through the earth for nearly 3 miles. Its grey walls rising up to 100 feet on either side of a fast-moving river that fills the gorge with constant sound. Drowning out the wheat fields just a short walk away and making it almost impossible to hear anything else once you step down between the rocks. This landscape looks unreal, not because it is large, but because it should not be here at all. These rocks date back roughly 2 billion years, among the oldest exposed stone in Europe. Surfacing in the one place on the plain where no such formation has any business appearing, among fields of wheat and sunflowers that stretch flat in every direction beyond the canyon's edge. As if the ground simply forgot to flatten itself in this one stretch. For the people of the nearby village, this canyon is not a geological marvel, but a swimming hole, a fishing spot, a place to cool off after work. Ancient stone is simply the backdrop to an ordinary afternoon, no more remarkable than the field beside it. For them, somewhere children have always gone in summer, and adults have always gone to think. This place did not become unreal by accident. A glacier dragged across the region tens of thousands of years ago. Then a river spent millennia cutting through what the ice had exposed, leaving behind formations locals now call the Ukrainian Stonehenge. Shapes that seemed deliberate but were carved by nothing more than time and water working without any plan at all. Tucked into the canyon floor, the remains of an old hydroelectric station. among the first built in the country over a century ago, sit half-collapsed beside the current, a brief human attempt to put the river's force to use before nature was simply left to continue on its own. What happens when a place becomes famous for being unreal is already underway. Weekend crowds now strain, a canyon built for solitude, and the granite, worn smooth in places by feet rather than water, shows it. The same way old stairs wear down faster at their center than at their edges. In the far south of Ukraine, the steppe reaches its purest form, tens of thousands of acres of grassland that have never once been plowed, flat to every horizon. Where wild horses, antelope, and ostriches move freely across terrain that looks more like an African savanna than a European nation. Dust rising behind them in the dry summer wind and settling again just as quickly. This landscape looks unreal, not because it is empty, but because of what was deliberately kept out of it. Agriculture, construction, almost all human alteration. In a country where nearly every other acre of similar soil has been turned into farmland generations ago, leaving this stretch as one of the last places where the original steppe can still be seen. For the rangers and researchers who work here, this is not an exotic safari, but a daily routine of fieldwork in one of the driest, most exposed parts of the country, where even growing a single tree required building an artificial oasis from scratch, watered by hand for years before the roots could survive alone. This place did not become unreal by accident. A 19th century landowner chose to protect rather than cultivate one of the most fertile landscapes on Earth. And that single decision outlasted empires, revolutions, and a world war, surviving changes of government that swept away almost everything else around it. What happens when a place becomes famous for being unreal has taken a darker turn here recently, as this protected wilderness now sits inside contested territory, its animals and its future uncertain for the first time in over a century. In western Ukraine, an entire old town sits on a narrow peninsula of rock, almost completely encircled by a deep canyon that the Smotric River carved out over thousands of years, so that from above the city appears to float on its own island of cliffs. The river curling around it like a moat that never stopped working and never needed to be refilled. This landscape looks unreal, not because the architecture is unusual, but because of where it stands. Renaissance houses, churches, and a centuries-old fortress balanced on the edge of a gorge, connected to the rest of the country by a handful of narrow bridges, suspended high above the water, each one a single, deliberate link to solid ground. For the people who live here, walking to work can mean crossing a bridge with a sheer drop on either side, an unremarkable part of the daily commute that visitors stop to photograph for several minutes before continuing on their own, much shorter, walk. This place did not become unreal by accident. Its natural moat made it nearly impregnable for centuries, and in 1919, it briefly became the last capital of an independent Ukrainian government, with nowhere else left to retreat to. The canyon itself functioning as a final line of defense. What happens when a place becomes famous for being unreal is visible at the canyon's edges, where erosion and tourism both quietly reshape the cliffs each year, each leaving its own kind of mark on stone that has otherwise barely changed in centuries. In the capital, two extremes sit almost directly above one another. Above ground, the golden domes of St. Sophia's Cathedral shelter a mosaic known as the Indestructible Wall, which has survived roughly 1,000 years of invasions, fires, and regime changes without falling, its gold leaf figure still visible against the dim interior light, exactly as it was when first set in place. Below ground, the Arsenalna metro station descends to a depth of around 345 feet, making it the deepest in the world. So deep that the escalator ride alone takes several minutes, the platform lit by a glow that never quite reaches the surface and never needs to. This contrast looks unreal, not because either extreme is unusual on its own, because they exist within the same few city blocks, one reaching toward the sky and the other burrowing away from it, separated by only a short walk and a great deal of stone. For the people of Kyiv, this is simply the geometry of daily life, a commute that descends further than most buildings rise, beneath a skyline whose oldest landmarks have outlasted entire empires that once tried to remove them. This place did not become unreal by accident. The depth of the metro reflects decades of planning for worst-case scenarios, while the cathedral's survival reflects centuries of being rebuilt after the worst case arrived anyway, again and again. What happens when a place becomes famous for being unreal is, here, almost a daily occurrence, a capital that measures its resilience in both centuries and feet, often at the same time. In the cobbled streets around Rynok Square, cafe culture in Lviv is dense enough that it can feel like the city's true infrastructure: courtyards, cellars, and corner tables filled at almost any hour. In a UNESCO-listed old town that has changed hands between empires more times than most countries change governments, its rooftops, a patchwork of styles from each era that passed through and left something behind. This landscape looks unreal, not because the cafes themselves are remarkable, because of how persistently they have functioned as something more than cafes. Informal meeting points, information networks, and quiet spaces for conversation that outside authorities rarely controlled or fully understood. No matter how closely they tried to watch, for the people of Lviv, sitting for coffee is not leisure in the conventional sense. It's everyday life, a daily ritual that has continued, largely unchanged, through Austro-Hungarian, Polish and Soviet rule, and through the upheavals since. The same tables filled, regardless of which flag flew outside or which language appeared on the signs. This place did not become unreal by accident. When language, governance, and borders shifted repeatedly around the city, cafe culture remained one of the few constants. A private space that public power struggled to reach, no matter how it tried. What happens when a place becomes famous for being unreal is, here, something quieter. Cafes that once hosted underground conversations now host volunteers, displaced families, and ordinary routines side by side, often at the very same tables. In the far southwest, Chernobyl looks, at first glance, like a piece of Vienna set down beside ancient forest-wide boulevards, ornate facades, and a university building modeled on a palace. Its towers and courtyards bordered by stretches of primeval beech forest, old enough to be protected as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and largely untouched since long before the city itself existed. This landscape looks unreal, not because the architecture is out of place, but because of how it got here. Built as a cultural capital under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the city later passed between Romanian, Soviet, and Ukrainian control without its physical form changing very much at all. The same buildings simply renamed, repainted, and repurposed each time authority changed hands. For the people of Chernobyl, this layered identity is not a curiosity. It's everyday life, a city where multiple languages, religious traditions, and architectural styles have coexisted in the same blocks for generations. Simply because no single regime stayed long enough to erase the others before the next one arrived. This place did not become unreal by accident. Rather than the city moving, the borders around it moved instead, repeatedly, while Chernobyl remained largely where and what it was, watching the maps redrawn around it from the same streets. What happens when a place becomes famous for being unreal is almost invisible here, hidden in plain sight, within ordinary streets, quiet courtyards, and forest paths that begin just past the last building. Ukraine is often pictured as a country defined by open fields and golden light. Yet, beneath that image lies a nation that, by any modern standard of geographic security, it should not have endured at all, sustained on ground too fertile to be ignored and too flat to be defended, layered with tunnels dug for survival. Ancient stone breaking through young farmland, cities balanced on cliffs or sunk deep below the surface, and capitals whose identity outlasted the borders drawn and redrawn around them. Its persistence is not the result of natural protection or certainty, but of a long familiarity with exposure, carried forward through small, durable forms. An embroidered pattern, a painted egg, a song passed from village to village, a cup of coffee shared in the same square for centuries. As instability becomes less of an exception and more of a shared global condition, Ukraine begins to feel less like an isolated case and more like a long rehearsal in what it means to exist without guarantees, offering a living lesson in endurance without the illusion of permanence. This is not a story that belongs to 10 places alone across the country in cities like Kharkiv, Dnipro, and the ancient streets of Chernobyl. The same quiet logic of exposure and adaptation repeats itself again and again, suggesting that this journey does not end here, but continues far beyond what any single episode could hold.